I want to focus your attention this morning on Luke chapter 15, the Gospel of Luke chapter 15. This is part 2 in a short series I started last week simply called Intervention. And last week we looked at the fact that Christmas in its essence is in fact an intervention. And so this week, I want to look at Luke chapter 15. I'm going to be reading from The Message, which is a translation written by Eugene Peterson. Some of you may be familiar with it. I normally read from the New Living Translation, which is an easy translation to read. But when I prepare my sermons, I typically read the passage in a variety of different translations just to see how they differ in some places, something I might pick up in one that I didn't pick up in another. And when I read this passage, this familiar passage from Luke chapter 15 in The Message, I thought, I want to read it from there. This is that famous story that Jesus told about the prodigal son. Luke chapter 15. Then he said, "There was once a man who had 2 sons. The younger said to his father, 'Father, I want right now what's coming to me.' So the father divided the property between them. It wasn't long before the younger son packed his bags and left for a distant country. There, undisciplined and dissipated, he wasted everything he had. After he had gone through all his money, there was a bad famine all throughout that country, and he began to hurt. He signed on with a citizen there who assigned him to his fields to slop the pigs. He was so hungry, he would have eaten the corn cobs and the pig slop, but no one would give him any. That brought him to his senses. And he said, 'All those farm hands working for my father sit down to 3 meals a day, and here I am starving to death. I'm going back to my father. I'll say to him, Father, I have sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son. Please take me on as a hired hand.' He got right up and went home to his father. When he was still a long way off, his father saw him. His heart pounding, he ran out, embraced him, and kissed him. The son started his speech. 'Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son ever again.' But the father wasn't listening. He was calling to the servants, 'Quick! Bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then get a grain-fed heifer and roast it. We're going to feast. We're going to have a wonderful time. My son is here, given up for dead, and now he's alive. Given up for lost, and now he's found.' And they began to have a wonderful time. All this time, his older son was out in the field. When the day's work was done, he came in. As he approached the house, he heard the music and the dancing. Calling over one of the houseboys, he asked what was going on. He told him, 'Your brother came home. Your father has ordered a feast, barbecued beef, because he has him home safe and sound.' The older brother stalked off in an angry sulk and refused to join in. His father came out and tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. The son said, 'Look how many years I've stayed here serving you, never giving you one moment of grief. But have you ever thrown a party for me and my friends? Then this son of yours who has thrown away your money on whores shows up and you go all out with a feast?' His father said, 'Son, you don't understand. You're with me all the time, and everything that is mine is yours. But this is a wonderful time, and we had to celebrate. This brother of yours was dead, and now he's alive. He was lost, and now he's found.'" So I want to start with a post I made this week that poked the religious bear. I don't do this stuff on purpose, I promise you. There's a particular audience I'm trying to reach, and anyway, you'll understand in a second. So this post that I made came out of a conversation I was having with someone who was drowning in guilt and shame because of their adultery. a person who had been convinced by Christians that God has abandoned them because of their sin. And so this is what I said to the person. And I realized at that time that there are probably a lot more people out there who are feeling the same way that this person feels, so I put it up on social media, and this is what I said. God doesn't love you more when you're serving the homeless, and he doesn't love you less when you're in bed with your adulterous lover. Now, we talk about the unconditionality of God's love. We read things in Romans 8 like, there is nothing that can separate you from the love of God, nothing in earth, nothing on earth, nothing in heaven. There is no good things or bad things that can separate you from God's love, because God's love for you is not dependent on what you do. It's dependent entirely on what Jesus has done for you. And we say those kinds of things and we amen that stuff. Yes, thank God. But then you get a little bit more particular about what that means, and you tease it out a little bit, like I did. What does that actually mean? If that is true, then what does that actually mean? It means this: God doesn't love you more when you're serving the homeless, and he doesn't love you less when you're in bed with your adulterous lover. That's how scandalous it is. Now, that simple comment broke the religious internet, okay? Unbelievable. Now, that wasn't my goal. My goal was to bring the comfort of God's unchanging love to those who are convinced God could never love them because of their filth. That's my goal. That's my goal most of the time, to comfort people by announcing that the sins they can't forget, God doesn't even remember. That's the goal. It's the audience. Those are the unsanitized people I'm called to. But after I said that, the religionists came out of the woods with pitchforks, okay? Pitchforks. I can't wait for you to burn in hell. I mean, these are some of the more mild ones, okay? I mean, the kinds of things that were said were just unbelievable to me, okay? Just for simply saying that. Most of the responses prove that many people have believed a toxic lie for a very, very long time. A very long time. For generations, the church has peddled a counterfeit message. One that peddles or swaps the radical, unconditional love of God for a moral scorecard. One that believes that God grades you based on your behavior and that his relationship to you is dependent on how you behave. That's what a lot of people think. This lie has taken root so deeply that many can't even imagine a God who doesn't grade on behavior. They can't imagine it. It sounds like heresy to them, like nails on a chalkboard. Religion whispers that God's disposition towards you hinges on your conduct. Be good, and God will like you. Mess up, and he'll be disappointed until you fix it. But here's the kicker. That is not Christianity. Never has been. True Christianity shatters ladders and burns scorecards. Burns them. It's not about climbing higher to reach God. It's about a God who climbed down, taking on flesh and hanging on a cross to meet us in our mess on the bathroom floor. The hard truth that religion can't handle is that God's love for you doesn't fluctuate with your behavior. It isn't a thermometer that rises and falls with your moral temperature. And this means that he doesn't love you more when you're serving the homeless, and he doesn't love you less when you're in bed with your adulterous lover. That's what that means. That's how scandalous and uncomfortable that is. His love is fixed, it is steady, it is unchanging because it is anchored in his fidelity, not yours. His faithfulness, not yours. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is the death rattle of a graceless religion masquerading as Christianity. Now, listen, don't get me wrong. I'm an expert in this. Selfish decisions have real consequences. Don't hear me say that, well, you just do whatever you want and all is well. You can do whatever you want, but all will not be well It might all be well vertically between you and God, but it will not be well horizontally. I mean, selfish decisions have real consequences, broken relationships, wrecked trust, scars that run deep, divorce, broken families, real stuff. Stuff that still haunts me 10 years after my divorce. So I know, but those consequences are horizontal. They're not vertical. Those are earthly wounds, not divine retribution. And until we get that clear in our heads, the face of God will always be seen as one with a snarl rather than a smile. Always. You know, when I crashed and burned and bottomed out 10 years ago and lost big as a result of my own selfishness and sin, and I was convinced because people were leaving my life, understandably so in some cases, but they were leaving my life, and I just assumed that God might leave too. I mean, I had given him every reason to bail on me. I'd given him every reason to walk away. He had been so good to me. He had been so faithful to me, and I squandered it. I took advantage of his gift. So God would have been perfectly justified in washing his hands of me and walking away. But he didn't. He stuck. He stayed. He didn't blink. He didn't bail. He didn't even give me the impression that he was tempted to leave or forsake me. And when that happened, when the friendship of God demonstrated itself by loving me at my worst, God's face changed for me. Changed. It hadn't always been a face with a snarl, a face that was seemingly disappointed all the time. You know what that face looks like. You've seen it in other people. Someone who seems perpetually disappointed in you because you never seem to be doing it right. You never seem to be doing enough. You never seem to be measuring up, and so on and so forth. And we can easily begin to picture God's face that way. And I did on a number of occasions and for years. And his face changed for me when I was at the bottom. It became tender rather than tough. It became sweet rather than sour. It was a face of delight rather than disappointment. It changed for me. And so even though the horizontal consequences we face are dire and drastic when we make stupid, foolish, destructive decisions, and they are, to make the mistake of equating those consequences horizontally with vertical condemnation is a huge mistake that binds people up in chains and makes people believe they have to perform for God in order to get God to like them or approve of them. But God's love isn't a swinging pendulum, it's a rock. The rock of ages. It's the one unshakable foundation in every storm. So, true Christianity is a scandal. A scandal. It delivers a grace that is reckless. It delivers a grace that is offensive. It delivers a grace that is unearned. And that's why it is such good news. That's why it relieves rather than burdens. Well, last week I talked about Christmas as an intervention. And we typically think that interventions are for bad people, people who have succumbed to the demon of addiction, and someone that loves them or a group of people that loves them intervene on their behalf to get them to see their need for help. But the truth is that interventions are for good people too. We need rescue from our vices and our virtues. And that's ultimately what this story is about. The story that I read. Let me explain. In the parable that I read, Jesus shows that there are two basic ways we run from God. Not just one. There are two basic ways we run from God. The younger brother represents the obvious way. He gives himself fully to immoral living. He breaks the rules. He's a quintessential lawbreaker. He's defiant. He's self-indulgent. He's rebellious. He's behaviorally out of control. He has a sense of entitlement. Give me my share of the inheritance now so I can go waste it on wine and women, which he then proceeded to do. Self-indulgent, rebellious, behaviorally out of control. He's licentious, carefree. In the person of the younger brother, Jesus gives us a picture of sin that is very common. He's just a bad dude doing bad things. Okay? That's very easy to detect. When we think about sin, typically that's what we think of. Bad people doing bad things. Punk kids doing punk things. That's typically what we think of. We think of lawbreakers. We think of those who are self-indulgent. We think of those who are reckless and rebellious and carefree and cruel. We think of those who live destructively. That's typically what we think of when we think of a sinner. Someone who's bad. Someone who does bad things. So Jesus gives us a picture of sin in the younger brother that is very common. But it's the older brother who represents a not so obvious way of running from God. Rather than living immorally, the older brother devotes himself to moral living. He keeps the rules. He's a quintessential law keeper. He's not defiant. He's compliant. He's self-disciplined. He's obedient. He's behaviorally under control. He's not wild and reckless like his younger brother. He's dependable. He's responsible. He's a hard worker. A man with a great work ethic. A man with integrity, character. So we have two sons in this story, one bad and one good. But if we look a little closer, we realize that both brothers and the ways of life they represent are more alike than it may seem. Tim Keller, who wrote an amazing book called The Prodigal God, which is about this thick, easy to read, I highly recommend it. Prodigal God, Tim Keller, says this in speaking about the two brothers. What did the younger son desire most in life? He resented having to access his family's assets under his father's supervision. He longed to make his own decisions and control his share of the wealth. How did he achieve that? He boldly asserted his independence, defying community standards and declaring his desire for complete autonomy. But what about the older son? Well, upon reflection, we realize he wanted the same thing as his brother. He too felt resentment towards their father and desired the father's possessions rather than his presence. However, while the younger brother left for a distant place, the older brother remained close and never disobeyed. His approach to securing what he wanted was more subtle. His unspoken demand was, I've never disobeyed you, so now you must shape my life according to my wishes. The elder brother is out for himself as much as the younger brother. They're just going about it in different ways. One is doing it by breaking the rules, and the other is doing it by keeping the rules. Two ways. The younger brother is trying to find freedom and fullness of life by being bad, and the older brother is trying to find freedom and fullness of life by being good. But both of them are on self-salvation projects. Both of them are on self-rescue missions. Both of them are. And while it may seem that the older brother is the better brother, Jesus shows that his goodness has created as much distance from the father as the younger brother's badness. That's his point. He's sharing this story to religious hearers who think that they're better and closer to God because they keep the rules. They do the right thing. And religious people go crazy when younger brothers are welcomed back into the home. Crazy. They go nuts. They hate it. They're allergic to grace. Allergic to it. Jesus wants us to see in telling us this story that it's not the badness we know we have that keeps us from God, but rather the goodness we think we have. You see, what created the barrier between the older brother and his father were not his sins or his bad behavior, but his pride in his own goodness. In other words, his self-righteousness is what kept him distant from his dad. So by the time we get to the end of the parable, ironically, it's the good older brother who's in a bad place with his dad, and it's the bad younger brother who's in a good place with his dad. Which is why I said last week that the desperate addict is closer to the heart of God than the devout moralist. For this reason. The immoral younger brother enters the father's feast. The moral elder brother does not. On his own. He was invited, but he just couldn't stomach the fact that his father would celebrate this bad kid when he had been good his entire life. Entire life. He believed that his father owed him a party. If you're going to throw a party for this kid after the way he's behaved, I've done everything right my entire life. I've crossed every T and dotted every I. I've served you. I've been faithful. I've been good. I've gotten up early and gone to bed late. You owe me a party. I'm entitled to your blessings. Entitled. To Jesus' original audience, this would have been shocking. His original audience reacted to Jesus' telling of this story much the same way that the religious audience responded to my post. Not equating me with Jesus, I understand that, but you get the point, you know? They're just so allergic to grace, so allergic to it. So to Jesus' original audience, this would have been shocking, a complete reversal of everything they'd ever been taught, ever. I mean, Jesus is the ultimate script flipper, the ultimate. Robert Capon, who's my favorite writer, said this about the parables in general, but specifically about this one too. And I love the way he puts it. He says, the parables in the Gospels, the parables, stories like this, set forth comparisons that tend to make mincemeat of people's religious expectations. Bad people are rewarded, like the prodigal. Good people are scolded, like the Pharisees and the elder brother. And in general, everybody's idea of who ought to be first or last is liberally doused with cold water. Jesus, the ultimate script flipper, constantly catching us off guard, constantly confronting our religious expectations, our conditional expectations, constantly, and it makes us uncomfortable. It's why they killed him. It's why they killed him. Throughout the Bible, and this is not just in this story or the parables, but throughout the Bible, it's the immoral person who gets grace before the moral person. Always. It's always the prostitute, not the Pharisee. Always. It's the unrighteous younger brother who sees his sin, not the self-righteous older brother. It's always the people who know that they're impure who are amazed at grace, not the people who think that they're pure. Always, always. Which is why, as I've said before, the devil's masterpiece is the Pharisee, not the prostitute. The older brother is running from God in his compliance as much as the younger brother is running from God in his defiance. Now, I want to make the point that both ways of running are dangerous. We end up with horizontal consequences that make life heavier and harder. They're both very dangerous. I've been guilty of both at different times in my life. I've been guilty of both this morning, okay? We're constantly going back and forth in the ways that we run from God, constantly. But I will say this, that compliant running is more dangerous, in my opinion. I think when we're running from God by keeping the rules, it's a little more dangerous than when we run from God by breaking the rules. And here's why, okay? Here's why. Sin hides in our goodness more deceptively than it does in our badness. It does. I've read this before, but nobody puts it better, makes this point better than my friend Ray Ortland. He says this: we feel the pain of our bad sins, but our good sins feel good, which makes them more poisonous. A man who commits adultery might feel bad about it, but a man who looks down on an adulterer probably feels good about that. Our good sins don't warn us. They don't shock us. They lie to us. They flatter us, and we love that flattery. Our lying hearts tell us we're just fine, but we're not just fine. Superficial appearance on the outside is the very thing religion is for. Denial, not facing ourselves, is the whole point of religion, he says. Perfectly said. That our sin lurks in our goodnesses more deceptively than it does in our badnesses, and that's what makes it more dangerous. They're harder to detect because we think we're good. We run, as I said, in both directions all the time. Sometimes we try to get what we want by doing the wrong thing, and sometimes we try to get what we want by doing the right thing. When we're trying to take something from someone else, it's bad, it's self-serving. But if we're trying to get something from someone else by being nice and loving, that's just as bad. That's just as self-serving. But it's more disguised. It's manipulative. I'm going to be nice and kind and generous so that people will like me, so that people will accept me, so that people will give their love to me, and so on and so forth. It's just as bad. One's easier to detect. You break into a house to steal something that doesn't belong to you, that's an easy sin to detect. But in your relationships, if you're constantly trying to manipulate the other person with your niceness so that they will give you the life that you want, that's thievery too. And it's much less detectable, much harder to detect. So the truth is, I need intervention for my weaknesses and my strengths. I need intervention from my badness and my goodness. I need intervention from my disobedience and my obedience, for my failures and my successes. I understand intuitively that I need an intervention when I fail, but I also need intervention when I succeed. Success is oftentimes more dangerous than failure. In fact, I can say this with some authority because I've experienced it, that my successes were far more toxic to my soul than my failures ever were. Ever. Because when you're succeeding and when you're rising and you start believing your own press and you start thinking that you're good, you begin to develop a pride in your achievements. Very dangerous, very toxic. Failure and the consequences that follow failure are sobering. But successes are intoxicating. My obedience, my goodness, my success, all of that stuff can be very, very, very dangerous because we start believing that we're not nearly as desperate as we actually are. Which is why my friend Steve Brown, who's preached here a number of times, has said for decades now that your sin is your greatest friend when you know it. And your goodness is your greatest enemy when you know it. That's the point that he's making. He's not saying sin is good, have fun. It's not what he's saying. The people that I talk to on a weekly basis who are at rock bottom for one reason or another, And the people that I talked to this week, the person in particular that I talked to this week, who is just drowning in guilt and shame and regret because of their unfaithfulness to their spouse. And to those people who are in the pigsty, like the prodigal son, and they're beginning to come to their senses, and they're beginning to realize, what have I done? What have I squandered? What have I done? I know what it feels like to be in that pigsty. I know what it feels like. I know what that stuff smells like. I know what it feels like to come to your senses at the end of your rope and go, where am I? How did I get here? What have I done? Who have I hurt? You get to that place and it's sobering. Sobering. But when you're at the top and you're cruising and you're rolling and things are just going so well and you're killing it, man, that can be intoxicating. Pride comes before a fall, as Proverbs says. And that fall doesn't have to be catastrophic, life-altering, but every fall, big or small, is preceded by pride. Every one. Believing our own press. That's why I refer to it all the time, and it's relevant here. That is why God refused to remove the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh. Not going to do it. Please take this out of him. I don't know if it was a habit or if it was a person or if I don't know what it was. If it was just a deep sense of regret for killing Christians before he came to know God, I don't know. I don't know. Sleepless nights for previous failures, I don't know. But he begged God. He says, 3 times, please take this thorn out of my flesh, please. Remove it from me, please. And God said, I'm not going to do it. And I'm not going to not do it because I don't love you. I'm going to not do it because I do. And I know that the moment I take that thing out and your life gets easier and smoother and, you're going to start believing your own press, distance is going to grow between you and me, and that's a dangerous place for you to be, Paul. So I'm going to keep it right where it is because my grace is sufficient for you. Sufficient. Everything you need, everything you long for, everything you crave. I've got you. I've got you. So as I said, the truth is that I need intervention for my weaknesses, yes, but my strengths too. I don't know what's worse on a Sunday afternoon for me. Leaving and thinking, man, you preached a hell of a sermon. Or leaving and thinking, what have I done? That was terrible, absolutely terrible. It made no sense. I didn't even want to be there. I think I confused people. I don't know what's worse. I don't know what's worse. They both kind of suck. But I will say this, that those Sundays where I leave feeling proud of myself, I'm in a much more dangerous spot. We all are when we find ourselves in those places, all of us. When we begin to think that we're better than the person next to us, we have it more together, when we compare ourselves to people to make ourselves feel better, when we spend our time pointing fingers rather than giving hugs, when instead of saying, me too, man, we go, how could you? That's a dangerous place to be. That is where the older brother was. And look at what he missed out on. I mean, look at what he missed out on. He missed out on a celebration. He missed out on a party. He missed out on mercy. He missed out on grace. He missed out on family and relationship and intimacy. So many things we sacrifice at the altar of self-righteousness. And we find ourselves distanced from other people and blaming them, always blaming, always pointing the finger. I mean, my gosh, we live in a culture of victims. All victims. Let me just set the record straight. All of us are victims and all of us are perpetrators. Okay? That's true of all of us. But man, we don't like to think of ourselves as perpetrators. We love to think of ourselves as victims. It's his fault. It's her fault. It's their fault. If things weren't like this, I'd be better. I mean, we do this all the time. It's a dangerous place to be. What do we miss out on? What does our self-righteousness rob us of? When I was getting these responses on social media, and I'm thinking to myself, two things. One, idiots, okay? Seriously, I felt very good about that, okay? See? I felt very prideful about the fact that I believe I'm right, and I know that they're wrong, all right? Dangerous place to be. But after I sort of worked through that self-righteousness, I had to work through it, mind you. Gosh, it's much more dangerous when we're right than when we're wrong, isn't it? Much more dangerous. But I kind of worked through that, and then my next feeling about these people was just sadness. What are they missing out on by maintaining a posture like this? What kind of biblical and spiritual and theological gymnastics do these people have to do in order to justify their cruelty? Like, who do they think God is? You know, a couple weeks ago when Russell Brand was here, and as I was listening to him speak, this is what I thought. One of my thoughts was, he knows the same God I know. When he looks at God, he sees the same face that I see. A face filled with grace, mercy, truth, forgiveness, welcome, delight. And to people who have a view of God that is just angry, vindictive, judgy, it shows up in their lives. When people think about God that way, when they see God that way, they start becoming that way themselves. You see it. I can tell what you think about God by the way that you are. If you're judgy and self-righteous and mean-spirited and you justify all that stuff by cherry-picking Bible verses, you know the Bible verse that people always cherry-pick when they want to justify their anger is, well, Jesus did flip the tables in the temple. I'm like, really? You go to one place. Now what about the other 5,000 verses that tell you things like, turn the other cheek? If somebody's robbing you, give them more. I mean, seriously, it's unbelievable how we twist and turn the Bible to say what we want it to say to justify our self-righteousness. Unbelievable. When Russell said, when he was here, how he justified his promiscuity biblically by saying that Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, and then he went on to humorously say that we will use anything, even the Bible, to justify whatever we want to justify. People do this. Religious people do it the most. They do it the best. But the gospel, which literally means good news, that's what the word gospel means, good news. That's why I've said now for years that if you walk out of here on Sunday morning and you feel like you have a long list of things to do, I have failed. I have failed at doing my job. My job is to deliver "it is finished" to you every single week. As I've said, my job is not to say 10,000 different things. It's to say one thing 10,000 different ways. That's my job. Because the moment we walk out of here, we're walking out into a conditional world where there will be people, society, who are telling us that we have to work for love, work for acceptance, work for approval, work for significance, work for security. We just need one spot, once a week, for 1 hour, to be reminded it is finished. A sanctuary, a place where we can find rest and respite from the grind. So the gospel is good news, and it's the good news that God's intervening mercy tracks down runners regardless of which direction they're running. God saves bad people who know that they're bad, and God saves bad people who think that they're good. He pursues rebels who run from him in defiance, and he pursues rebels who run from him in compliance. He goes after people who think God owes them for their obedience, and he goes after people who think that God hates them for their disobedience. So, in this sense, his intervening grace is no respecter of persons. He goes after both kinds of runners. So, take heart, and I'll close with this. This is what I want you to remember when you walk out the door. Your worst days are never so bad that you're beyond the reach of God's grace, and your best days are never so good that you're beyond the need of God's grace. Period. Let's pray. God, thank you for your mercies, which are new every morning. Every single one of us would be screwed without them. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.